So this talk today is about uncheatable assessments. One of the sections of my new book is assessment and using innovative ways to solve some of the biggest challenges in education right now, particularly from low student engagement and artificial intelligence. And so it seems to resonate with a lot of folks, so I decided to spend a little bit of time talking about that today. You can follow me on the contact info you see on the screen there, X, formerly known as Twitter, Instagram, and then that's my email if you guys have questions or want to keep the conversation going when we're done here today. And so like Aaron was saying, I joined this writers group to work on this book. It took me 2 years to finish it. Slow and steady wins the race, I guess, although Erin is as a sprinter, she got her book done pretty quickly. It took me a while, but I'm so glad that I did it. And it's been endorsed by folks like Seth Godin and Ken Burns, and really resonates with a lot of people out there. That QR code right there is a direct link to purchase the book on Amazon, and then we can talk about more of that later. So, all right. So just a couple of facts. Like one of the challenges that I had naming the book and figuring out what to do to help support educators is this idea of story projects. And that's what I teach. I'm a high school media arts teacher. So I teach film production, broadcast journalism, photography, and graphic design. These are all types of digital storytelling. But a lot of teachers don't see themselves as storytellers, right? They teach math, or they teach science, or they teach history. They're not storytellers. But in fact, we actually do expect students to tell the story of their learning all the time. It just happens to be through essays and tests and presentations. And so what I'm offering is an expansion of that mindset and a way to allow students multimodal ways to access our curriculum, to personalize it, and through this process of project-based learning in a student-centered capacity to actually support and elevate what we need the kids to do already. And so one of the big parts that was important to me of this book was citing research. And this is some of the research that is in the book to support and back up what I have discovered anecdotally over 25 years of teaching. So telling is an effective way to improve literacy. Curiosity improves reading and math skills. Image-based content, meaning more than just words and text and a textbook, alongside the text-based content can help supplement learning for students with or without cognitive disabilities. And this idea of memorization of facts doesn't help higher level thinking the way that project-based experiences can. And we talk about building and creating these stories as a project. And so it helps to elevate and really nail home the learning, which is what it's really about. So these are just a few citations. There's many more in the book, and I continue to put new ones that I find every day on LinkedIn and Twitter and things like that. But definitely important if you need to make the case about why project-based learning and in particular story projects is so important. So first of all, let's back up for a second. We're talking about uncheatable assessments. Like, how can I get the kids to not cheat, right? That's what a big concern of a lot of teachers. Like, now they've got AI, you know, the kids are going to cheat and they're faking their essays, or they're just like typing in a prompt and coming up with the answer. And so let's back up for a second and talk about what an assessment is and what they're for and why we use them traditionally and how we might rethink what that means. So for me, I think a lot of these definitions are what I think most educators might consider as the purpose behind assessment, right? Checking for knowledge, which to me is just knowing definitions or dates or facts. Checking for understanding, which is different than knowledge, right? So that's the ability of making sense of what this means, maybe connecting some dots. Maybe we use it to measure progress, right? How advanced is the student? Are they making progress in their learning? Are they learning all the things that they need to by a certain benchmark of time, for example? Accountability, both for the teacher as well as the student, right? Like, how well are your students doing? How many of your students pass the AP test? How are they doing on the state standards, right? And then we turn it around on the kids too, and we say, well, you're accountable. And if you don't turn in your work on time or to this quality level, you're going to get a bad grade. And then we also use it sometimes as a motivator, more of a stick than a carrot, to say, like, if you, again, don't meet this benchmark standards, then you're going to get a bad grade. Or we've got to turn it in by this deadline. And so you can see that while these might be well-meaning and in some cases might actually be constructive, I feel, and every educator in here is probably nodding their heads right now, like these can be turned around and used in a very damaging way and not very helpful or constructive way for the learning, right? So if we're checking for knowledge, are we just asking kids to memorize? How do we check for understanding? Is an essay really understanding, or can you actually do something with this? Can you make something with it, on your own? And how do you make good decisions about that, right? How do we measure progress? And is that a valid metric? And who came up with this metric? And if everybody's accountable for the exact same information at the exact same time in the exact same way, A, you're not understanding that every human is unique. And B, you're setting yourself up for failure as a teacher, because that's when you have cheatable assessments. If everybody's expected to have the same answer, then of course you can share the answer, right? And so we just kind of sidestep all of these problems by using these story projects instead. Okay, and that's what we're going to talk about today. And I've got a bunch of examples towards the end to show you as well, some case studies. So why would kids cheat in the first place, right? They're supposed to be nice children, well-meaning humans, but they are humans just like you and me. So why would we cheat? Why would we cut corners on things in our work or in our learning, right? So there's some interesting research on this. The Gallup poll did a survey last spring of high school students in the United States, and they gave their schools a B- overall. And what was really telling is that only 13% of students gave their schools an A rating when it came to making them excited about learning, right? So if kids don't want to be here in the first place, if they see our assignments as boring or that there's not a point to it, right? We're setting up the conditions for them to cheat. Like, I don't really care about it, so I'm just gonna do what I need to do. So how can we, reframe that, turn that around so that we eliminate the motivation to cheat in the first place? The second big thing is artificial intelligence, right? And I know, like we mentioned earlier, a lot of teachers are concerned about this at the higher ed level as well as K-12. We're thinking the kids aren't doing the work, if they're using artificial intelligence. And so this is a poll of those folks as well, of educators, about some of them not even knowing what AI is. Probably by now, I think people have a better picture of what it is. This is almost a year ago now, but still like a lot of concern over it. So these two conditions are kind of colliding to create the conditions that I hope my book will help solve. So, let's just think about our own experience, right? Raise your hand if you've had a memorable experience with a standardized test, right? Probably a traumatic, memorable experience, not a very positive one, right? And so what does that really mean? This is really about efficiency, and this is about ranking rather than checking for understanding or seeing if students can actually apply their knowledge and the concepts from our curriculum in the real world, which I hope is what our goal is. And so when you think about that, again, every student has the same answer. We're treating every student as the same, and we open ourselves up to cheating. It's a possibility. And so I sort of opened my book with this quote from the author of The Little Prince, who said that if you want to build a ship, don't drum up people to collect wood and don't assign them tasks and work, but rather teach them to long for the endless immensity of the sea. So this is sort of like the summative part of the manifesto. I consider my book sort of a manifesto in a way, that if we want kids to be able to learn, to continue to learn when no one is looking, when there's not a grade hanging over their head, like, I don't know, when they become an adult and this new thing called climate change happens and they've got to deal with it, or racism comes up and we've got to deal with it. Like, there's no answer in the back of the textbook. So how do I educate myself so I can become an informed voter and citizen? And so instead, maybe we encourage through, yes, we need to teach our curriculum and we need to teach our skills and things like that and our concepts. But more importantly is this love of learning. Like, let's find a way to make the learning wonderful and beautiful and passionate and magical. And so no matter what we do, the hard work that the students put into it, it's because they care and there's something beautiful and amazing that's going to end up as the result. And that's what this is. So in the book, I set up learning as, the story projects as a framework for the learning. The students are working on this beautiful, amazing project, anything from a single photograph to a digital book, to a podcast, to an explainer video or an infographic. And they care so much about creating that project because they know it's going to go into the world and people will see it and be impacted by it, that they forget that they're learning. And like, I got to learn the math to do this data visualization, and I've got to learn the design skills, and I've got to do an interview, and I've got to do research and write a annotated bibliography to get all this information right, because I know it's going to impact people. They don't even care about that anymore because they're focused on the main goal of creating this beautiful story. And so that's kind of what this is all about, is elevating the love of learning and facilitating that mindset that will propel the kids to success in their future and the rest of their life. And so that's what I've done for 25 years. It's all about experiences. It's all about projects. And it's all about centering the student as the responsible party for the learning, not me dictating, not me being a police officer, making sure that they've checked the boxes and they're not cheating on their assignments every day, right? Having ownership. And so when I think about it, and I was writing the book, I kind of boiled it down to these three concepts is what's really going to help us, create a great learning experience. Especially in the world of AI now. Ironically, it's kind of brought back to light the importance of the humanity of learning and what's so important about us as humans is this concept of originality, having a personal connection to the concepts in the curriculum, and then having a purpose behind the work. And you and I know this all the time. Like your boss gives you something to do, or some report you've got to write. You're like, well, what's the point of this? No one's going to see it. Why am I doing this? Same thing, right? We ask our students, what's the point? Why am I doing this? Right? Not just because, and not just because of the grade. So these are the three things that I think are really going to help us get through this AI situation and also help elevate the learnings of kids who don't want to cheat in the first place. So cheating happens when the learning doesn't have these things, when these things are lacking. And so that's what we're going to talk about today, is how to do that. So let's rethink our assessment here in the first place. We talked about some early reasons of why we use assessment and why it's there in the first place. So let's stop and rethink, what are we measuring? And another famous quote that I love a lot from Thomas Pynchon is, if they can get you to ask the wrong questions, they don't have to worry about the answers. So we got to ask the right questions when we're asking, what are we assessing and why? This is, maybe you're familiar with these things. These are rubrics. I am not a fan of rubrics. I tried it. And essentially it's the same thing as a standardized test. It's a box that the kids have to fit in, and they're going to come back and they're going to argue, well, is this a 23 or a 24? And why? And ultimately it's a subjective choice that you're making anyway. So I avoid rubrics, and I had this conversation with somebody who's in this webinar today about this as well. Maybe have one giant box of a rubric. So but we got to have some way to assess, something to grab onto and measure, right? And go like a goal to set, like we need certain standards, we need you to achieve a certain amount of things. And so what I would argue is that we should measure values rather than systems. So a system measurement is what we just saw with the rubric or a multiple choice test. A value is something else. It's something that's maybe intangible. It's something like courage, the courage to ask an important question that might ruffle some feathers, but needs to be asked. The courage to do something a little bit harder than the kid next to you, rather than, did I get the right points on this assignment, right? What do I need to do to get that score? It turns into like a motivating factor rather than a punitive one, right? Things like in my class also, we talk about courage, but we also talk about professionalism. What does that mean? And what's cool about this is that it's flexible, whereas the systems like rubrics and standardized tests are inflexible. It doesn't make room and space for student curiosity. I can't decide, I really need to learn this concept in science, but I'm going to take it this way. But it's not in the rubric, so come back, right? And then we kind of squelch that interest and that curiosity and that humanness. So I would say measure values over systems, emphasize process over results. We know how that works, right? With a sports team is a good example of that. Yes, you want to win the game, but if your team is getting stronger and better, maybe you're going to make it to the playoffs and then you can win the championship, even if you didn't win every game. So, or there's players on the team who make the rest of the team stronger, even though they're not the star, they don't score the most points, but the team does better when they're on the court. What's going on, right? So maybe it's about this process. And again, the process we can start is what kids should be learning, because they keep making new history. There's new scientific discoveries. There's new art and all of this stuff coming out all the time. So we need the kids to be prepared to manage that process and continue to learn later on in life, not just what's in the textbook right now. So things will change. So we need them to be able to adapt for later on. We want learning to be active rather than passive for all of the reasons. We don't want passive citizens. That's a recipe for disaster. We need people to be active participants in their communities, and also independent thinkers rather than compliant. So this is a challenge that a lot of probably higher ed teachers face too. It's like, I need you guys to go solve this problem. And they're like, but where's the answer? Like, what do you want us to come up with? Right? And they're unable to then solve real world problems. And it comes back to this concept of authenticity that we hear all the time. What is authenticity? For me, authenticity just means real. It's not fake. It's not a simulation. Like, yes, there are times in my class and in many classes when it's important to simulate something. We're going to practice this, test it out in class before we do something for real and put it out into the real world. But ultimately, like I tell all my students, is like, we don't do pretend in our class. Learning is always real. Every day it's real. Your life is real. Your emotions that you bring in with you, the world around us and outside the classroom is real. How are we going to interact and how are we going to connect what's in the classroom to that life that we're living outside, right? And so we need to model those skills, we need to model those mindsets, and we need to model those interactions in our class so students can have a healthy relationship to the curriculum and to each other, right? And so I think it's a misplaced set of priorities that we've got right now in the education system, where it's data driven, right? You hear data, data, data. Show me the data. What's the stats on student learning? Learning loss. What's the data on it, right? But I think we're asking again the wrong question, right? We should be emphasizing human-centered experiences over data-driven processes. And I feel that's just really, really important because again, we're dealing with humans. We're not dealing with machines. So what are authentic assessments then? What might this look like in a classroom? So for me, I'm talking about story projects. So that's everything from digital books to infographics, data visualizations, podcasts, editorial illustrations, documentaries, explainer videos. Even a single photograph that's annotated can be a type of story. And what's really great about these projects is not only are kids learning the technical pieces of digital literacy and media literacy, but they're finding ways that best suit them to explain and share their learning. It's finding ways to best approach the material. So for example, you can write words down, but it doesn't compare to a voice or a photograph of a person or an incident. And so really thinking about what are the best ways or combinations of ways to show what you know, literally show what you know, not a bubble sheet, right? And not a worksheet that doesn't really show what you know. And then again, look at these images here. These are all original. There's only one of them. So it's uncheatable, right? All right, so let's think about this a little bit. Seth Godin, who I love a lot, has a great quote. He said, projects are the new resume, right? And we know this if we use LinkedIn professionally and things like that, that how do you prove what you know, that you're an expert in something? And you've got to have an artifact, you've got to have evidence of that. And so, we really should be moving towards a resume-based sort of, a resume and folio-based system of assessment for students. Not only track their work over time, but sort of collect it in a professional way so they can, again, sort of model those professional work habits that we want to see them do later on. But that's really the proof of it, And so for me, learning isn't about what you know, it's about what you can do with what you know. Like, how do I know how to apply this in the wild when no one is looking? And so, again, it's like memorization is great, but then you throw it out the window and I don't know how it actually works and applies. So that's what these projects are doing. So let's dive into a couple of case studies. And I believe Jesse McNulty is actually with us today. This is graciously shared by him from one of his student projects. This is a data visualization. And what's beautiful about this is the story, and maybe Jesse can chime in a little bit later, had a student in his math class who didn't like math, was not interested in learning math, but does love sports. And so Jesse worked with the student to come up with a way to combine his passion for sports with math, in this case, data analysis. And so this, what you're looking at is a heat map of shots taken on goal for a lacrosse team, right? And so this is something you see all the time now within the NBA and other professional sports. It's an actual legitimate real world thing. And this kid got jazzed about it. He learned to love math through his personal passion. It wasn't do it because I said so or you're going to get a bad grade, right? That's when the cheating happens and people don't like math anymore and they don't like learning anymore because we made it painful. And instead it's like, oh, I can use this to help me. I can use this to help other people. And he just did this really, I get goosebumps thinking about it. I did this really amazing teacher experience with his students to like leverage the student passions to learn math. So really fantastic. Thanks for letting us share that. And this is in the book as well. So thanks, Jesse. We appreciate that. Here's another example from the book as well. So these are from my friend Jody Deinhammer, who is a high school science teacher in the Dallas area. And this is in her biology class. The students are doing markups of a photograph. So in this case, they're learning about bones and bone structure. And the students have to annotate these by actually using their iPads and the Apple Pencil to like mark up and write and label these things. So, and these would be a photograph from their lab. So they'd be, working in the science lab, take pictures of it, and then they would have to annotate. And then as it's explained in the book, she talks all about how she does it and the outcomes from her students. But it's really great because, again, each one is unique. And the students have to apply their knowledge that they learned in the other part of the class, maybe it's a direct instruction piece of the course, to this particular very unique situation that they're working on in the lab. And it's unique. It's in the kids' handwriting and they've got to understand it, right? It's pretty great. This is a project that I have my students do all the time. It's a public service announcement. And I'm not going to play the whole video, but I can share the video with you guys later if you'd like to see it. It's a 30-second public service announcement, which are, those videos encouraging good behaviors like here's how to vote or wear your seatbelt or anti-bullying campaigns and things like that. And so what, we're talking about student ownership and responsibility for learning, what people used to call choice and voice. I like to call responsibility. I gave them a big challenge and said, okay, we want to address climate change through these PSAs. Now you go do the research and then you figure out what part of that you want to turn into a story and then you make the story, right? And so I'm not a science teacher, although this could have been a science project. I'm not a history teacher because this is about public opinion, right? So this could have been a social studies project. I don't teach social studies. I teach filmmaking. So technically, I'm just looking for the cinematography and the editing part and the writing, but really the kids are learning all these other things at the same time. And even though I set a big container and said climate change is the big topic, they got to take it in a lot of different directions and come up with their own approaches to it, whatever made sense for them and whatever they were personally passionate about. So this is where you can marry the needs of your curriculum and the state standards with the student passion and agency, right? So it's a big overlapping Venn diagram if we just do it right. And this project ended up winning a national award as well. So the student got outside accolades because we published it publicly. And the thing about this all too is like authenticity isn't just about, putting it in a box for a grade and then it goes in the trash, right? This is about putting it out into the real world. We'll see some examples of that in a second. Also, we took my students to foreign countries to produce documentaries. One of the best projects ever made was this documentary my students made in Vietnam. Again, I'm not going to show it as 10 minutes, but it's beautiful. And it was a really great experience for the kids to have to wrestle with these concepts of history that they don't get to in US history because there's not enough time to make it even to the Vietnam War. And so where does that leave our kids? Right? Unable to manage real world issues that are happening right now because we start teaching history at the beginning of time rather than, which I think is backwards. And so this was a beautiful experience for them. She integrated her poetry as the voiceover. They learned about the religion, spirituality of Vietnam, and also this idea of the limits of their knowledge, which is really what the point of the story was ultimately. It was like, I can't make sense of this because I'm not of this place. I can learn a certain amount, but I know there's a lot more left to learn. And that was like a mic drop moment for me as a teacher because here we are, like, there's a lot more to learn than what's in the textbook. And this is just the start. Okay, infographics are a great way. This is, again, my friend Jody, the science teacher. She felt it's really important for her students to help the community. So health and science facts that the community needs to know about. So the students are making these projects not just to take a test and not just to appease the teacher, but to actually make a positive impact on the community outside. And so when we have this as a goal, the students are going to create an authentic, real piece that goes off for other people to see. It can also help other people, right? And so there's a really great piece, a heartfelt human piece to that too. Like the students are important and their work is meaningful. It's not just, to pass a test. And so I think about, for me, the 4 pillars of assessment. There's teacher assessment, right, as the expert. There's a self-assessment. Peer reviews as well, I think, are important. And then an interesting component when we publish work publicly is an audience assessment, okay? And then that can come in a lot of different forms, whether it's likes or comments or some other kind of feedback, polls and things that you solicit. But a really powerful one for me was, there's a couple actually. A student did a documentary about Homeboy Industries in East Los Angeles, where they rehabilitate former gang members. And so we have these, rich white girls on the west side over in Manhattan Beach going over to the east side to meet these former gang members who are Black and Latino, very different social status and class and all of this, and had this amazing experience. So they produced a documentary and then they created a blog post on our website, sort of reflecting on it. And so what was cool about that is, like, again, this is published for an authentic audience. This wasn't just for me. This is to explain to their audience the transparency of their process, what they did, and the impact it had on them. So that was a really powerful, meaningful moment. So the learning itself becomes learning for somebody else. They get to learn about the process. Another project, another trip we took to Cuba to produce documentaries. One of my students produced this doc, published it on her YouTube channel, and she's like, came in one day, she's like, Hernandez, somebody wrote like this really mean comment on my post. And I'm like, what's going on? You can see it right here. Somebody who lives in Cuba saw her video and gave her feedback, like honest feedback. Now, he wasn't bullying her, he wasn't doing anything like that. He was legitimately concerned that, this wealthy American girl had come in and told the wrong story and got it wrong. There was stuff that was missing. There were holes in her story. And he called her out on it. And she's like, well, what should I do? And I'm like, well, why don't you reply to him? And why don't you explain what you were doing? And so they ended up having a conversation in the comments with somebody living in another country about her work in my class, right? And then they ultimately came to a conclusion. They kind of understood each other, and she learned so much more than the grade that I gave her. And I gave her an A for the project, but what does that say? What did she really learn? Here, she learned, because there was authentic feedback from an audience member, like there's really deep learning that happens when we do that. And then she reflected on it in her personal blog as well. So all of those layers are being hit, and this is only possible if we allow our students to publish publicly. Some other great projects I love are these social graphics where students address like a current event issue, something they're passionate about. I love this one. This is from just this past year, being inspired by Barbara Kruger and her artwork, right? And being able to address like complex issues, like talk about high level thinking through editorial cartoons and memes. Talk about ironies, the really difficult, complex concepts to understand and master. So we're really talking about high level thinking that has to happen for these projects to be successful, right? And I think, again, the mindset that a lot of people have is like, stories are just this storybook thing, this fluffy thing you do on the side, once the real learning is done, the boring stuff. Once that's done, then we'll maybe give some time for you guys to play over here and do this cute little project. No, all of this stuff is probably way more powerful and more important than your essay, because no one's going to read that essay. And, as much as I love writing and feel it's one of the most important skills you can have, like the real world doesn't revolve around essays. When was the last time you wrote an essay? A 5-paragraph essay. But when was the last time you saw a meme or a political cartoon like this that literally changes minds and voters, right? So we really need to engage in all of these things. And it's high level thinking that has to happen. So we really need to not only rethink assessment, but rethink learning. So let me give you a cheat sheet for uncheatable assessments, right? And that cheat sheet is these things, sort of reframing, and what we just talked about is, first of all, defining what those learning outcomes should be or need to be. And we talked about values and determining what values you want to emphasize with your students, maybe even developing a mission statement for your class or your grade level or your school. What do we believe students should be able to do? And what should their work look like? And what kind of impact should it have? How do we leverage curiosity and passion rather than squash it? And instead of seeing that as an avenue to chaos, or, oh my gosh, everyone's going to have a different answer, how do I grade it? You're like, yeah, everyone's going to have their own unique piece. And what's really beautiful about that is it's fun to grade. Like, I'm not bored looking at a stack of papers with the same answers, right? Over and over. And the kids aren't bored coming up with the same answers. So learning becomes joyful and interesting and creative. We can honor self-determination and responsibility. Again, what we used to call choice and voice. I like these terms: self-determination. So the kids have the responsibility to figure out where they're going to go, and the responsibility for the outcome. Like, how does this impact other people? And that really is something that our society needs a lot more of, getting outside of our head and ourselves, because we're always turning inward. It's like, this is all about me. And it said, no, this is going to have an impact on other people. Is that the impact that we should have, or we want to have, or need to have? And how do we craft our story in a way that's going to be productive rather than destructive. And then again, making personal and community connections. So how can I apply this to what's going on in my world and what I see other people struggling with around me? So anyway, those are sort of my takeaways for this whole thing here. So on screen, I've got a QR code to resources. If you guys want to scan that, feel free to do that. And that goes to a doc that has some links and some other contact info if you guys want to stay in touch. And of course, my email is right there. I'd love to continue the conversation and keep going after we're done here. So with that, I'll just maybe give it back to Aaron or Sarah, and we'll do a Q&A, and I can stop my screen share if everybody has that info there. Let's see if I can find my stop share here.
Awesome. That was so great, Michael. Thank you so much. And
Okay.
I will dare to say that might be the best inspiration hour we've ever had. So thank you for that. I'm feeling very
Thanks.
inspired and lots of thoughts. So I'd love to throw a first question your way. And then for everybody, feel free to either put your questions in the chat if you'd rather do it that way. And Sarah can share the questions with Michael, or feel free to unmute and ask your own questions here in a minute. But yeah, I'm curious, Michael, just first question. I have a couple, but I'll just share a first one around more values that you measure. I love how you talked about, not rubrics, but values, and you shared about courage and professionalism. I'm curious what other kinds of values you often measure in your students.
Yeah, I mean, so those are like the big overarching ones, right? And generosity is the other one, like the three that I have like this year. Like it's changed over my career. It's sort of evolved, I guess. So it's courage, professionalism, and generosity. And we talk about what each of those means in different contexts. And then overall, as a member of a learning society, there's a group of us that are artists and we're working, or journalists and we're working. What does it mean to be generous to yourself, to your audience, to your peers? And, professionalism and courage, we need to have the courage to speak truth to power, to, embrace historical fact and science.
Okay.
Strange that we have to do that, but here we are.
Yeah.
Having courage to ask good questions. So, with each project, there are different criteria. And I think, we give exemplars like most teachers do. Like, here's like a really good example of a PSA. And we see like several professional ones going back to that particular project. We see several professional PSAs, and we see several student ones from the past years that were successful, which is always nice. I wouldn't just show student ones only. You want to aim high. And so when we talk about those rubrics, like what's going on in the real world, and that changes, like I know Donnie, who's on the Zoom here, is a music professor, and new composers come out. There's a new way of thinking or looking at an older composer that we didn't know about. We learned something new about somebody from the past, or some new invention comes out, and maybe a new instrumentation or recording device or something like that. And so we need to adapt and be flexible. So we might show that, but there are specific criteria that I would give, like a checkbox rather than a rubric. Like it's got to be this length. It has to have this many X, Y, or Z's in it. The cinematography has to have these things and avoid, crooked shots and out of focus things, things that we build up. So there's a lot of smaller skills and exercises that build up into some more complex projects. And we do that through experience. The other thing too that I didn't mention in here, but I talk about a lot in the book, is the workshop model of learning. So when you do a project like this, you can't just say go and come back in a week with the PSA. Like it's going to be a disaster. But any kind of project, really, if it's a science experiment or an essay that you're writing in your English class, or a research project for social studies, you have steps and you have drafts and you get feedback from the teacher and from peers. That's the 4 pillars piece, right? And so you have a chance to fix things. And I talk this all the time in my kids. I have to unlearn what you learned in your other classes. Is it's not all or nothing. You're not stuck with this first attempt. Like sprint to this finish line, and then we're going to talk about it. And we're going to give you some feedback, and you can go back and make changes if you want, so that when you submit it, it's going to be this much better rather than your first attempt. Isn't that better than being embarrassed by your first? And they're like, oh, okay. Like they're not used to that. But I feel that's how the real world works. I mean, all of us think about, we go through drafts of emails even that we're sending to colleagues, or it's a new course that you're doing, and you do it one semester and you tweak it for the next semester. It improves. And I think we want to model that professionalism that this is what professionals do. Professionals don't just take out a standardized test and that's it, you know? So anyways, kind of rambling answer to your question, but.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, the rigor, right? The rigor is the real world. You have to have trial and error and fail forward and all of that. And yeah, I love the add around generosity because it's evident in how you talk about the work. You know, some of those projects that you're showing could potentially be viewed as a student project, but you're flipping it. You're saying, no, it's helping people. The way you kept saying it's helping people. And so helping them realize it's not just a student project, it's being published and it's something that can help educate someone else. So adding that sort of real project-based learning to a project in a different kind of way, that's inspiring how you're talking about it as a generous act. So, yeah.
We have a question in the comments from Sheila. She is asking for suggestions for baby steps to get started.
Absolutely. So always start small. Maybe just take an assignment you already have and just modify it slightly. You know, we can talk more about specifics about what you teach and what you might want to do. But for example, you might just do a photograph or do an annotated photograph, or a social graphic is a really easy one to do with some of the free apps like Canva or Adobe Express. That doesn't cost anything and it's just a quick pivot to what you do. Maybe think about turning a small essay assignment into a podcast where the students just kind of record themselves speaking, not reading the essay, but writing it in the book. I talk about how to sound like a real person. When you write a script and perform for a podcast, it's a lot different than how you write for, you know, I don't know, graduate school English literature class. So you can do a small pivot like that. And when you do the projects, keep them very small also. So one of the things that's challenging as you start to branch into these kinds of multimedia projects is it's very different in the same way that, you know, the movie version of a novel is very different than the novel, right? You can't fit everything in. It's a completely different medium. And so you can't expect to have the same kinds of content in there. So you break it down into small pieces. So if you're going to do a video project, for example, like an explainer video, which is one of my favorite projects in the book, make it short, make it 3 or 5 slides. That's it. Just make it really short. And then as the students get comfortable with it, as you work out the kinks, you can sort of expand it and get more complicated with it. So start small, both in terms of the small assignment that you're giving. Maybe it's a formative assessment rather than a summative assessment. And then once you have that, and then also in terms of length and size of that project, keep it tight. Videos should be no longer than 60 seconds until you get to, unless you're teaching a documentary class like I did and the kids could go up to 10 minutes. That's a huge whole other world. 60 seconds, because also your audience doesn't have an attention span for longer than that. So be mindful of the audience as well. You're making this for someone else who maybe is not interested in your subject. Like, tell me why I should be watching this math video right now. Why would I stick around for 5 minutes to watch this? Right?
Can I pop in with a question?
In like 30 seconds and boom. Yeah. Okay, sorry.
Can I pop in with a question just to follow up?
Sure.
When you introduce something like this to your class, do you kind of centralize it around a theme, like we're talking about climate change, and then you can represent it in many different ways? Or do you flip it and say, we're going to be talking about, I don't know, podcasts, and you can choose what topic you want to do a podcast on?
That's a great question. And it was a big challenge as I wrote the book. I'm like, how do I structure this? Is it by technical thing? Is it by subject area? Is it because they all overlap? So again, the class that I teach is media arts, right? So we're focused on the technical pieces. And so I would have separate assignments so my students would learn all of them: explainer videos, podcasts, video stories, building up into more complex pieces. I'm not sure, maybe what subject area do you teach, or areas?
English and history.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. So again, this is an option for you. If you decide, you know, again, going back, setting your goals, what do I want my students to be able to do? If you want your students to be able to interview an expert, for example, like a historian or a stakeholder in your community who was around at some event or time period, and your goal is to teach kids these interview skills and to interact with other humans, not on a text message, then maybe you want to do an interview, and that could turn into an oral history project, like a podcast. Or if your assignment is, I need you guys to study this period of history, and you can report on it in one of 3 ways. You could do a podcast, you could do a digital book, right? You could make an explainer video, you know, or all 3. So you could give them a choice of what they're doing. In English class, since it's focused on a lot of writing, digital books are a great option because then you can take actual writing. So maybe it's short stories or poetry and put them into like, a literary magazine, which is a digital book. And then so you can have them write as they normally would, knowing that they're going to be selected to go into this magazine. And then you can also compile and add in artwork and audio from the music students, right? As an audio widget that you can add. And you can link out to somebody else's website. What I like to, there's a section in there on hyperlinks and using them as sort of like a live annotation, the footnotes actually go live to the actual source. So you could do it that way as well. I don't know if I'm answering your question or not, but yeah, hopefully that helps.
Very much so. Thank you. I feel
Okay,
very
got it.
inspired.
Okay, great.
Ellen is wondering how much direct instruction is involved in this approach and what ages. Do you recommend what grades for this approach?
Great. Yeah. So for age level, anybody can do it, even kindergartners. So I actually just had dinner with my fourth grade teacher last night, who I hadn't seen in decades. And, we're talking about all of this. And for the students, especially who can't write, they're language learners or they have a disability or something, they can speak. So how do we get the ideas out of them? It's not about, again, the assessment, it's about the values. I need their ideas. And so younger students might not have complex writing skills yet, but they've got great ideas. And how can we honor that in a medium that's going to allow them to express themselves rather than be limited by the technical nature of these things? So grade level is great. And one of the case studies in my book is actually a third grade class that created their own podcast. And they interviewed like an astronaut and the governor of their state and everything. It was amazing. They did it monthly. That's really fantastic. So check that out. So that's grade level. And I'm sorry, the other part of the question was
how much direct instruction is given?
Sorry. Still early here in California. So direct instruction, yeah, it sort of depends on the project. There is direct instruction happening, and in your subject area, there's going to be direct instruction. I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. You need some of it. Before the pandemic, I was already recording videos. So my lectures were videos, which are much more accessible to everyone because you can put on closed captioning. They're explainer videos, so there's images alongside and even some animations that I would create in Keynote. I use Keynote to do my presentations. Animations, closed captioning, kids can pause it, they can rewind it and go back and forth. If a kid is absent because they're sick or it's a snow day or whatever, they can keep learning, they can reference and go back to it. You don't have to repeat yourself year after year, week after week. It's already recorded. And that's a great reference. The parents can see it, their tutors can see it, and so that's really great. And then when you flipping the classroom, right, you offload that direct instruction. And then class time is teamwork, group work, teacher feedback, because every project's different. So they need me to sit down with them and go over the projects with them, or we critique them and put them on screen at different stages. The kids will do pitches in front of everybody so that they can get feedback from their peers and learn from each other and be inspired by each other. So we use that class time as a really valuable human connection time, and the direct instruction stays, offloaded. Now, I teach high school, and you know how it is. You're not going to do anything unless it's graded. And didn't I just say like grades are like not a good thing to use for motivating kids, but they kind of do. So instead of making it like a huge test, on cinematography, I give them a short quiz. It's like worth 5 points or 10 points, but the project is worth 30 or 50 points. So there's a little bit of accountability, like I got to get this done, but also I give quizzes that are open note. So there's no cheating. There's no need to cheat because I've got the notes. I can do whatever I want. And I just need to in the way I write the quizzes, it's multiple choice and there's images and they've got to define it. And I just don't put so much value on the test for the direct instruction. It's just sort of a check-in to make sure that they've done it. And for right now, maybe you guys have a better idea. For right now, that's kind of working for me. And that helps support what they're doing. And I talk about that. Like, these are the tools and the skills that you need in order to do this project that you're working on that you care about. And when we frame it that way, they can see, again, the purpose behind doing this. So yeah, it's just a matter of balance and weight, what your values are, and explaining to the kids and being transparent about the process. It's not a mystery, or I don't like you, I'm going to make you suffer. It's just like, I'm helping you make your vision come to life.
I love it. I led so many programs where it was kind of centralized around the very type of thing that you're doing. And you, it's just like you could just see the passion, excitement, interest, and like activation of purpose. It's so clear to me. And I guess I was just curious about the direct instruction piece because it's such like a topic right now of debate around like discovery learning, problem-based learning versus direct instruction. And so I love that answer. And I was just curious.
Yeah, thanks. When I started teaching, I was definitely like, you gotta learn it. And I had a textbook and I made the kids read like 40 pages in like 3 days. And we're gonna take a test on this. And I was like, what was I doing?
Yeah, right.
And it was painful and not fun. But there is direct instruction. You've got to have direct instruction. But all the research is also saying that you have to have context, right? You learn best when there's context of some kind, both like pre-learning and post-learning, and also the purpose. Why are we doing this right now? And if it's just memorize the textbook and do the answers at the back of the chapter or take this test, there's no context, so it's not really sticking anyway. And so again, it's framing it that there is this direct instruction. It's important to know these skills, these terms, so that we can all speak the same language. You've got to know how to do this so you don't make mistakes, so you can get your message across clearly to people, because people have done this before you. And this is all the bag of tricks you're going to need to complete your work that you really want to do. So it's just sort of a reframing of it. Yeah.
Love it.
Yeah, I will say.
Oh, go ahead, Ellen.
Well, I was just the last thing. In the beginning of it, you had one of the excerpts from the researcher, one of the titles around like retrieval and storytelling. And I hadn't really thought about that before. And I think that's so powerful. Like retrieval is like how you learn, how you kind of how you kind of embed it in your neurons and all of that. And the idea that storytelling, of course, that is the way you retrieve it. And I think the direct instruction piece is just like, are you retrieving the right thing? But that it's such a powerful hook. So I love that framing of retrieval and storytelling.
Yeah, love it. I just have one more quick question, Michael, just around group work. You mentioned group work, and of course you mentioned assessment via peer or audience. And it sort of reminds me a little bit too of the studio school methodology. I think the frame is like, do it with passion, do it in groups, and do it for real. And so I'm wondering, like the groups piece, you're talking about assessment, but also do you have them do things in groups, the projects in groups, and how does that manifest as it relates to everything else we've talked about?
It depends on the class and it depends on the assignment. And in the book, I talk a lot about how to work with groups, how to grade group projects. And I think one of the biggest fears of group work is everybody gets the same grade. So that means one kid's going to carry it and everybody else is going to slack off. Reality. And so that's one thing. The other thing is like teachers are like, how do I grade multiple kids? Because it is challenging. It's like, okay, what if this one kid does the performance piece, the other kid wrote it, another kid did the editing? Do they all get the same grade? And so you have to kind of like let go of this command and control mindset as a teacher, that you've got scores for everything and you're bean counting everything and everyone's going to be equal. And instead go back to what's the goal and how did these guys work together? So I go back to like grading values rather than systems. So, there's different ways to check in. I can look at them, I can hear them, because we're doing this work mostly in class, although there's some outside of class projects that they work on. So I can observe, that's data collection. It's called rich data, observation, and qualitative is called rich data, not just data. And then they have self-assessments, and they have private self-assessments that they share how the team dynamics. And that's usually great because the kids who, they can be discreet with being honest and truthful about how things worked. It's very clear from the beginning, everyone's going to get feedback on you. So how do you want to be spoken about, right? But again, it's not snitching. This is how the real world works. If I get evaluated at work, it's someone's observing me. My administrator's coming in and observing me, right? And then they're asking students, like in higher ed, fill out the survey. How did your professor do, right? Under these different metrics. So it's, again, encouraging good social behavior rather than punishing for what someone hasn't done. And I think that's the big trick, is like, how can we use assessment as a goal setting device rather than a punishment metric, right? How far have you not come? And that's the grade that you get, as opposed to what did you achieve? What original thing did you do? How generous were you? How courageous were you? Because if I have those rubrics, there's no creativity and there's no risk taking, right?
Mhm.
And for me, that's the biggest value of all, is we need kids to be courageous.
Good.
Thank you so much, Michael. I hate to be the one to put an end to this conversation. I can tell everybody loved what you said, and it was really interesting to hear your thoughts. So thank you so much for sharing. You mentioned the word punitive and that you don't want learning to be punitive. And that is something that Erin says all the time. And that's what we do at Desklight, is we try to make sure learning is not punitive and that it's meaningful for people who are putting on learning experiences, and we like to help them with that. So right in line with the work that we do at Desklight, Michael, and it was super interesting. We loved hearing from you. So thank you everybody for coming. Join us again next month. We have, I believe it's going to be on March 14th next month. So tune in then, and we thank you for coming.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, everybody.